And there's just a few slides on here, so there's not a lot. Most of what we're doing on the muscular system is going to be done in lab. So the naming of the muscles will all be on the lab practical and not on the exam. So there are just a few review questions over Chapter 10. All right, so muscles work because they create forces across a joint, which is part of our lever system. So at a joint, a muscle will cross that joint, pull on the opposing bones, and create a movement, such as flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, all those that you learned before. So the lever is something that moves on a fixed fulcrum. So we can look at some other things that are levers. A scissors is a lever, tweezers is a lever, the jack that they show in this picture is a lever, and the force is always going to be our muscle applying the force. What is good about levers is it makes it so you are able to move things that are heavier further and faster than you could do without the lever. And so you look at this jack. A person can lift a car using a jack, but they certainly couldn't do that with simply their arms. The effort is going to be what we apply to move that load or the muscle contracting. Power levers work at a mechanical advantage, which means that you can do something like jack up a car where you can move a lot of weight, far more than you could with just your muscles alone. But think about how a jack works. It's very slow. It's time consuming. Speed levers, on the other hand, would be if you're pitching a baseball, for instance, or just throwing something in general. Picking up items on a shovel and throwing them, like snow that we might be shoveling soon. But they work at a mechanical disadvantage, so you can't do this with a car. Okay, and that's common sense to you, but that's really what this is saying, is you can't move the same amount of weight nearly so much as you can with a power lever. Okay, look at the difference between the effort and the load. Okay, the effort and the load and the fulcrum are where we're going to see differences in the different kinds of levers that we're going to look at. So in this case, the load is far from the fulcrum and the effort is near the fulcrum. Okay, scissors is an example of what we would call a first-class lever. Okay, there are three classes of levers. What determines what kind of lever it is where the fulcrum is. Is it between the effort and load? Is it the other end? Is the effort in the center? So with a first-class lever, the fulcrum is at the center. So you can see on a scissors how that works very easily. But now look at the picture on the right that shows you how the trapezius muscle at the back of your neck helps you to tip your head back. So the load is just simply the weight of your head and tipping it back. And it's going to be tipping on those occipital condyles of your skull, down on the atlas. A crowbar is also, and a seesaw are also first-class levers. And again, you just simply have to look at where the fulcrum is at. A second-class load is more like a wheelbarrow, where the load is at the center. Fulcrum's at one end. We don't have very many muscles that use second-class levers, not very many joints. But standing on your toes, your gastrocnemius muscle is providing the effort there. The load is the weight of your body, and the fulcrum is the point at your toes where you're bending that joint so you can lift up on your toes. So we don't have a lot of those, but there are a few. So remember that a wheelbarrow is an example of that, also the gastrocnemius, and standing on your toes, tiptoes. And then finally, the third class lever has the effort at the center. So when you squeeze on a tweezers and pinch something, the effort is at the middle, the load's at one end, and the fulcrum's at the other end. And most of our skeletal muscles work this way. So you can see the bicep muscles on this one, the origin up at the top of the humerus, the insertion on the forearm, and that muscle then provides the effort to lift this weight or load. Okay, some of you have already had this in lab, but others will be having this in lab. Different muscles look different. They have different arrangements of their fibers. Some are really wide and flat. Some are more round, more rope-like. Some of the most common ones are these parallel muscles, like the sartorius muscle. That's always an easy one for everybody to remember. They have kind of an expanded belly to them, like the biceps as well. Triceps would be the same way. They have a lot of ability to shorten, but they're not as powerful. You can't lift as much with your biceps as you could your rectus femoris, for example. The pinnate muscles have short fascicles that are attached at an angle or obliquely and have a central tendon at the center. So the rectus femoris is an example of this. Much stronger muscle, actually. Looks more like a feather, and that's because it's the bipinnate. Bi means two. Unipinnate would be just one side of the feather. Muscles like the pectoralis that they show up at the top are convergent. There's a very wide portion of it that narrows down into a one point of insertion. So the pectoralis muscles enable us to bring our arm towards the center of our body. Very wide muscle, and there are several of those as well. And then the circular ones are the easiest ones. Orbicularis oculi. So orb is circular. Ocular, anything with oculo or ocular in it is eyes. And everything with oris is mouth. If somebody is giving an oral presentation, it has to do with talking, right? Okay, now we've talked about lots of flexors and extensors on our arm and things like that. Lots of muscles work together. But the muscles on the opposite sides of the joints have opposite actions. So the one that is primarily causing a movement, so let's think of flexing our arm at the elbow, like you were doing bicep curls. When you flex your arm at the elbow, the prime movers would be your bicep muscles. The brachialis might also be involved, maybe some of the other forearm muscles to help you stabilize that movement. But the prime movers are also called the agonists. So the biceps brachii in a bicep curl would be the agonist. The muscles on the opposite side of the joint do the opposite movement. So the tricep muscle is responsible for extending your arm at the elbow. Okay, so putting the weight back down from a bicep curl or lifting it to the posterior side. So the antagonist in a bicep curl are the triceps brachii. Sometimes they help to regulate the action so you don't overextend a joint. You don't want to hyperextend joints for the most part because you can do damage to tendons and ligaments. But these are the ones that are found on the opposite side. But if I said, okay, what's the prime mover in extending my arm at the elbow, then it becomes the tricep as the prime mover. So you're talking about one specific movement when you're talking about prime movers versus agonists. And then there are always those smaller muscles, and think about your forearm. You have several flexor muscles that help the agonists or the prime movers by promoting that same movement, or they just simply kind of stabilize the joint during the movement. Okay, so in lab this week, what we're going to do a lot of is use a lot of different terms for naming muscles. And you've already done part of this last week in lab. But there are many factors that we use, and you'll do a little short exercise in lab. Some of you have already done this on naming muscles. So the location is usually the bone that it lies over. For instance, the rectus femoris means femur. So that muscle lies over the femur. The orbicularis oris is around the mouth. Medial or lateral side of the body, deep or superficial, more towards the surface, is superficialis. Shape of the muscle, a delta. If you think of a delta of a river coming into an ocean, it's a triangular shape, so that's where they got that name of that muscle. If it's circular, they got the orbicularis from that. And latissimus is wide, means wide. So some of these come from Greek and Latin terminology. And if you knew some of that scientific Greek and Latin, it would help you to remember some of these names a little bit better. But latissimus dorsi, for instance, when you do lat pulls at the gym, everybody knows what a lat pull is for the most part, and think about which muscle it is that's doing that. It's the latissimus dorsi. The size is pretty easy. Longus and brevis, carpi radialis longus, carpi radialis brevis, gluteus maximus and minimus, pectoralis major and minor. So those are named for which one is the larger of the two. A couple terms that you just need to remember and learn is rectus means straight. So you think of the rectus abdominis, goes straight up and down the abdominal cavity. And the obliques would be like the transverse or the external and internal obliques of the stomach. How many origins? A quadriceps, quad means four origins, 4 heads of origin. Bicep and tricep, 2 and 3 heads of origin. Now, if a muscle has 2 heads of origin, it might not necessarily have those in the name. For instance, take the gastrocnemius. You don't see bicep or tricep in the gastrocnemius, but it has 2 heads. The origin insertion might also be in there. I always think of the sternocleidomastoid. So we've got sternum. Cleido means clavicle. Mastoid means mastoid process. Okay, and then we have a few others listed here. Thyro means thyroid cartilage. Hyoid, so from the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone. Frontalis, over the frontal bone of the skull. Supraspinatus, supra means above the spine of the scapula. And then there's also an infraspinatus, below the spine of the scapula. So be thinking about these things as you are learning these muscles in lab. Actions of the muscle, we've talked about abduction and adduction. So we have muscles that are adductors and abductors. Abductor pollicis longus. Okay, that's action of the muscle's abductor. Pollicis is where that muscle attaches to, which is the thumb. Pollex means thumb. And longus means its relative size. The brevis is the other muscle in that area. So we have abductor pollicis longus, abductor pollicis brevis. And if you hold your palm out in front of you, facing you, and move your thumb out to the side, that's abduction of your thumb. And those abductor pollicis muscles are what allow you to do that. Okay, we've talked about supination and pronation of your arm. So we have supinators and pronators in our forearm. We've talked a lot about flexors and extensors on the forearm as well. So many of those terms, and there's others besides these, you'll use these over and over again. So become familiar with these, and it really, really helps you to remember what the muscles are. Okay, so you can stop the recording here. I'm going to give only about 5 seconds on each of these, so stop the recording and see if you can figure out the answer. Okay, so that one is A, prime mover. And that one is C, parallel. And finally, this one, B, the number of cells in the muscle. The bigger the muscle is, the more power it's going to have. Okay, so you just got a few review questions on this chapter, and that's it for this chapter, but you will use a lot of this information in lab this week. See you in class.